It is 1925. In Rome, a hunchbacked man rises to speak in Parliament. He weighs barely 100 pounds. His voice is weak. Mussolini sits across the chamber, heckling. The little man ignores him. "You fascists," he says. "Your ruling class is corrupt. You have impoverished the workers and the peasants alike." He is tearing apart the logic of fascism to the fascists themselves. Within a year, they will lock him in a cage for the rest of his life. Tonight, we unravel the story of Antonio Gramsci, the man who would become the most influential Italian thinker since Machiavelli. He wrote the playbook for understanding how authoritarian movements capture democratic societies. His concept of hegemony, the way rulers control not just bodies but minds, has become essential vocabulary for anyone trying to understand politics in the modern world. Yet the man himself died in obscurity, his teeth rotted out, his family beyond reach, and scribbling in notebooks that the fascist censors believed were harmless. How did this happen? How did a sickly child from one of Europe's poorest islands become the thinker who showed us that culture is a battlefield? And why did Mussolini's prosecutor demand that they stop this brain, as though ideas themselves were dangerous weapons? Before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps others discover these explorations of history. And let us know in the comments which topics you'd like us to explore next. Now, Gramsci's story traces one of the 20th century's great tragedies, a brilliant working-class boy who clawed his way to a university education, a journalist who helped lead the factory occupations that terrified Italian industrialists, and finally, a communist who watched his party fail to stop fascism, then spent a decade in prison trying to understand why. So settle in now as we trace the path of this remarkable man, from the sun-baked poverty of Sardinia to the freezing cells of fascist Italy, from the factory councils of Turin to the clinic in Rome where he finally stopped breathing. Along the way, we'll discover why his questions about intellectuals and ordinary people, about the long work of changing minds before seizing power, still demand answers today. This is the Bedtime biography of Antonio Gramsci. Chapter 1. The Hunchback of Ailes. Antonio Gramsci came into the world on the 22nd of January, 1891, in the small town of Ailes, on the island of Sardinia. He was a healthy child at first, blonde hair and blue eyes, the kind of baby that made relatives smile. His family traced their roots back to Albania, generations removed. For 18 months, nothing seemed wrong. Then a lump appeared on his spine. His mother, Peppina, refused to believe what doctors would later confirm. She clung instead to another story, one that made more sense to her. A servant had dropped the boy down a flight of stairs and concealed the accident. This explanation, however wrong, gave her something to hold on to. The truth was Pott's disease, tuberculosis of the spine, but that diagnosis wouldn't come until 1933, when Antonio was already a man in his 40s, wasting away in a fascist prison. The family's response to the deformity was brutal. They suspended the boy from the ceiling in a homemade contraption of leather and metal rings, hoping the weight of his own body might straighten what had grown crooked. He hung there for hours. He endured it because they told him it would cure him. It did not cure him. When he was 4 years old, following severe hemorrhages and convulsions, a doctor declared him nearly dead. Peppina went out and purchased a tiny coffin. She bought a special burial suit. She kept both objects in the house for years, waiting. The boy survived, but those items remained, a quiet testament to how close he had come. Then came the second disaster. In 1898, his father Francesco was arrested. The charges were embezzlement and falsifying official documents. Francesco worked as a registrar, a respectable position, and the family's fall from grace was swift. Local political rivalries had played their part. So had money troubles. The 7-year-old Antonio and his siblings were told nothing about the arrest. Their father was simply away, they were told, in a place called Gaeta. Antonio believed this for a while. He learned the truth from other children, village boys who taunted him with what everyone else already knew. His father was a criminal. The family shame was public knowledge. Antonio had been the last to find out. He never forgave the lie. Years later, he called it a severe educational error, a squeamish deception that taught him to withdraw from the people around him. He stopped trusting his environment. He became obsessed with telling the truth, perhaps because he remembered so vividly what it felt like to be denied it. Sorry for the interruption. Instead of playing an ad, I have a small request. Please consider supporting us on Patreon. For $3 a month, you get ad-free access to our entire back catalog. More importantly, you help keep this kind of work going. In an age of algorithmic slop, real research and writing is more important than ever. The link is in the description. Thank you. Now, back to the story. The family sank into poverty. Peppina refused to ask her husband's wealthier relatives for help. Pride, or something harder than pride. She sewed shirts. She ironed late into the night, keeping the coal-heated iron alive with a hand fan, standing for so many hours that her legs swelled. The children ate beans and potatoes, 7 of them, and one mother holding everything together. Antonio watched her. He would later write that she stood alone, a poor woman, against a terrible storm, and saved her 7 children through sheer tenacity. He was brilliant in school, perfect marks in every subject. It made no difference. At 11 years old, he was pulled out of class and sent to work at the local tax office. 10-hour days, 9 lire a month, the equivalent of a kilo of bread per day. His job was to move registers, heavy ledgers that weighed more than he did. At night, he cried from the pain in his back. His deformed spine wasn't built for this kind of labor. Meanwhile, the sons of butchers and pharmacists continued their education. Antonio was smarter than any of them. He knew it, they knew it. He went to work anyway. He tried to return to school by studying on his own, preparing for an exam that would let him skip ahead. When the day came, a teacher asked him if he knew the 84 articles of the statute, the Italian constitution. He stood there trembling. He couldn't answer. He wept. The cruelty of official education toward those without money or connections was something he would remember. His father returned from prison in 1904, a broken man. The release allowed Antonio to resume his studies in the town of Sant'Ulisurgiu. He walked 18 kilometers on weekends to get there, or rode in a carriage when he could afford it. Once, on the road, someone shot at him. Pranksters, they said. He made his own toys and sold them. He gave private lessons to younger students. He built heavy stone dumbbells and tried to strengthen his weak arms. He developed a sardonic sense of humor, the kind that lets a person survive what shouldn't be survivable. Books opened a world beyond his village. Robinson Crusoe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. He read, and he watched the people around him, the gentlemen in their fine clothes, the pig farmers in theirs. The division seemed absolute. In a school essay, he refused to celebrate Italian unification. For Sardinians, he wrote, the mainland had brought no liberation. The world was divided between oppressed and oppressors. He was beginning to understand which side he was on. He finished his high school exams at the Dettori Lyceum in Cagliari, living with his older brother Gennaro in conditions that bordered on squalor. Some days they ate only one meal. In 1911, he won a scholarship to the University of Turin. It was offered to students from the old provinces of the Kingdom of Sardinia, and he qualified. He had never left the island. He packed what little he owned, boarded a ship, and sailed toward the mainland. Turin was a city of factories and fog, utterly foreign to everything he had known. He carried his brilliance with him. He carried his resentment, too. Chapter 2. A Sardinian in Turin. Antonio arrived in Turin in the autumn of 1911. He was 20 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and his spine curved in a way that made strangers stare. The city was nothing like Sardinia. Factories lined the river. Smokestacks rose against a grey sky. Fiat was building automobiles at a pace that seemed almost violent, and Italy had just invaded Libya, so the streets hummed with nationalist fever, flags everywhere, young men talking about empire. He found a room in a working-class district. It was small and cold. He had no winter coat. The scholarship paid 70 lire a month, which sounds reasonable until you subtract 25 for rent, then food, then books. What remained was almost nothing. He skipped meals. He survived on milk and coffee when he could afford them, and sometimes just coffee when he couldn't. The cold did something to him. Sardinia has mild winters, sea breezes, that particular Mediterranean light. Turin in November is fog and damp that settles into your bones. Antonio's already fragile body began to fail. He stopped speaking for months. Not out of choice, but because words wouldn't come. He forgot vocabulary. He later described hallucinating during his worst fevers, seeing a giant spider descending from the ceiling to suck out his brain. Whether this was metaphor or genuine delirium, we can't know. Probably both. The University of Turin was rigorous, dominated by positivism and the historical method. Antonio studied linguistics under a professor named Matteo Bartoli. who recognized something in this strange, silent young man from the islands. Bartoli had him draft lecture notes. The work planted seeds that wouldn't bloom for decades. Ideas about language and power, about how dialects rise and fall based on cultural prestige rather than inherent worth. These were concepts Antonio would eventually transform into something far more ambitious. He was a difficult student in the best sense. He refused to be what he called a knowledge receptacle. He criticized the university for producing know-it-alls rather than critical thinkers, and gravitated toward the few professors who treated culture as something living, something that mattered beyond examinations. He found most of his education elsewhere: the socialist press, the gates of the Fiat factory, the chamber of labor where workers gathered to argue and organize. When he first left Sardinia, Antonio had been a nationalist. He used to shout about throwing the continentals into the sea. The island's poverty felt like occupation, like colonization by the Italian North. This made a certain emotional sense. But in 1913, he returned home for a visit and watched peasants voting for the first time. Something shifted. He saw that Sardinian liberation couldn't happen in isolation. The peasants of the south and the factory workers of Turin were fighting the same system from different angles. Regional separatism was too small a frame. He came back to the mainland, a socialist. He started talking to people. He befriended young radicals who would later become important figures: Palmiro Togliatti, Angelo Tasca, others whose names would eventually appear in history books. He read Crochet and Salvemini and Marx, but always with suspicion of easy answers. He rejected the fatalistic determinism that infected socialist thinking at the time, the idea that capitalism would simply collapse on schedule, like a building with a demolition date. By 1914, he had mostly stopped attending classes. The rhetoricians of the faculty repelled him. He called the university a corrupt place of official lies. His academic career ended not with failure, but with abandonment. He stopped taking exams. He lost his scholarship. He chose poverty over credentials. The war years were hard. He taught private lessons to survive. He wrote theater reviews for the socialist paper Avanti, but the reviews were really political critiques in disguise. He attacked the bourgeois audience for applauding trivial art. He analyzed their moral complacency through the plays they enjoyed. It was criticism as a weapon. In August of 1917, bread riots erupted in Turin. The army opened fire on workers. The city became what some called the Petrograd of Italy. Antonio watched and understood. This was the vanguard. This was where things would happen. Then came news from Russia. The Bolsheviks had taken power. Antonio wrote an article called "The Revolution Against Capital," arguing that Lenin had defied the orthodox reading of Marx. A revolution wasn't supposed to happen in a backward country. The theory said you needed an advanced industrial economy first, but Lenin had proved that political will could override historical schedules. This was exhilarating. This changed everything. The young man who had arrived in Turin, unable to afford a coat, who had hallucinated spiders and forgotten how to speak, was becoming someone else. The cold had not killed him. The poverty had not broken him. He was 26 years old, and he was beginning to see the outline of something, a different kind of politics, a different kind of revolution. Chapter 3: The Journalist and the War. By 1915, Gramsci had found his weapon. It was cheap paper and black ink, the clatter of a printing press running through the night. He earned a little over 1,000 lire a year for this work, less than half what a high school teacher might bring home. Someone offered him a proper teaching position once, steady money, respectable hours. He turned it down. He wanted to stay in the fight. His pen had a particular quality. Readers described it as acid. He turned that acid on the war propagandists, the hack journalists he called, gazettieri, men who sold spoiled merchandise to the public and called it news. The Great War was grinding through Europe, and the papers were full of patriotic nonsense. Gramsci took it apart, line by line, exposing the imbecility underneath the flag-waving. He found an unexpected outlet in theatre criticism. This might seem like a strange detour for a revolutionary, but Gramsci understood something about audiences. He reviewed the bourgeois plays of the day and used them as mirrors. When Ibsen's A Doll's House came to Turin, he watched the crowd watch Nora. They could not understand her. Their Catholic and feudal morality, as he put it, could not grasp a woman's right to walk out the door. The play became a diagnostic tool. It showed him exactly how deep the old thinking went. He lived nocturnally in those years. The editorial offices of Il Grido del Popolo became his home. The Cry of the People, they called it. A socialist paper, underfunded, understaffed. Paper was scarce because of the war. The presses were loud. Gramsci worked through it all, transforming what had been a standard propaganda sheet into something more ambitious. A review of socialist culture, he called it. He wanted the paper to make people think, not just agree. He had a particular hatred for what he called encyclopedic knowledge, the idea that education meant stuffing facts into heads like sausage casings. This produced intellectual cripples, he argued. Culture was something else entirely. It was discipline, self-knowledge. A class that wanted to seize power had to first understand itself, had to know its own history, its own position in the machinery of society. Without that, revolution was just noise. In 1917, he published a single-issue paper called La Città Futura, the Future City. It contained what became his most quoted line, "I hate the indifferent." He meant it as a provocation. Apathy, he argued, was the dead weight of history. It was what allowed evil to flourish. The people who stood aside, who claimed neutrality, who said politics was not their concern, they were the ones who let the worst happen. The war had militarized the factories of Turin. Women filled positions left empty by conscripted men. Raw recruits arrived from the countryside, unfamiliar with machines, unfamiliar with the city. The combination was volatile. Exploitation and repression ran side by side. Gramsci observed it all from his desk, taking notes, building his analysis. He saw how the industrial North drained the agricultural South, how the Italian state used the southern regions as a kind of internal colony, extracting cheap labor and raw materials to prop up northern capitalism. The professors at the university had become cheerleaders for the war. He called them intellectual hyenas, buffoons playing at patriotism while young men died in trenches. Late that year, he started something he called the Club of Moral Life, a small group of young socialists who met to read and argue. He assigned them Croce and Salvemini, demanding essays, critiquing their work without mercy. He wanted to purge them of cliché thinking. This was the molecular phase of revolution, as he saw it. The future ruling class preparing itself intellectually before it could act physically. He even rejected the crude anti-clericalism of the old guard. Calling religion stupid was itself stupid, he argued. Religion satisfied real human needs. Socialism would have to replace it with a higher faith, not simply mock it. By 1918, the war was ending, and Turin was ready to explode. Unemployed workers filled the streets. Veterans returned to find their jobs gone. The old methods of the Socialist Party, the parliamentary speeches and careful trade union negotiations, seemed obsolete. Something had cracked open. Gramsci began meeting with a small group of young intellectuals, Togliatti, Tasca, Terracini. They talked about building a new order, an Italian form of the Soviet that could organize the chaotic energy of the masses. Gramsci had noticed something in the Fiat factories, the internal commissions, the grievance committees where workers aired complaints. They could be transformed. They could become the nucleus of a new kind of state. His attention was shifting, away from the streets, toward the point of production, toward the factory floor where the future might be built. Chapter 4. L'Ordine Nuovo and the Factory Councils. The armistice had been signed, but Turin felt less like a city at peace than one holding its breath. Factories that had churned out shells and rifles now stood uncertain of their purpose. Workers who had survived the trenches returned to find their old jobs vanished or their wages halved. And somewhere in this chaos, a strange new energy was stirring, something that hadn't yet found a name or a shape. On the 1st of May, 1919, a slim weekly journal appeared on the newsstands. It was called L'Ordine Nuovo, the New Order, and it had been scraped together on a budget of 6,000 lire. Most of that money came from Tasca. The four friends worked out of a cramped office that smelled of ink and tobacco. Above the masthead ran a motto that captured something of Gramsci's character. "Instruct yourselves," it read, "because we will need all our intelligence. Agitate yourselves, because we will need all our enthusiasm. Organize yourselves, because we will need all our strength." In its first weeks, the journal drifted without clear direction. It published cultural essays, book reviews, abstract discussions of proletarian art. Gramsci would later dismiss this early phase as a collection of abstracts, high-minded but toothless. The real turn came in June, when he and Togliatti wrested editorial control from Tasca. From that moment, L'Ordine Nuovo found its purpose. Gramsci began writing about the factory councils. Inside plants like Fiat, there already existed what were called internal commissions, committees that handled worker grievances about foremen and piece rates. But Gramsci saw something else in them. He saw the seed of a new society. These commissions, he argued, should become organs of worker power, Italian versions of the Russian Soviets. The worker had to stop thinking of himself as someone who sold his labor for a wage. He was a producer. He could manage the machines, organize production, run the factory floor without any capitalist standing over him. This was an idea that terrified the industrialists. It also unnerved the trade union officials, who saw their own role as mediators suddenly threatened. If workers could govern themselves directly, what need was there for negotiators? Gramsci spent his days and nights shuttling between the editorial office and the Chamber of Labor. He listened to metal workers complain about their foreman. He sat through long meetings about wages and hours. He called this molecular work the slow, patient labor of understanding, piece by piece, how power functioned on the factory floor. Then he translated what he heard into theory. His physical presence in these rooms was peculiar. He spoke in a voice so quiet it barely carried across a table. Yet when he opened his mouth, rowdy assemblies of metal workers fell into absolute silence. He had no talent for demagoguery and no interest in it. He preferred a method he compared to Socrates, drawing out the truth through questions rather than proclamations. Those who met him in this period described a man whose intellect seemed to overpower his broken body. He had a rude seriousness about him, a kind of pessimistic kindness. He believed the Italian state was collapsing and that only the working class could prevent complete disintegration. "The present period is revolutionary," he wrote, "precisely because it is evident that the class holding power is incapable of enduring." Not everyone agreed with his approach. Tasker wanted a slower, more gradual education of the masses, culture as the accumulation of knowledge. Gramsci countered that culture was discipline, the creation of a new personality, not the piling up of facts. Meanwhile, Amadeo Bordiga and his abstentionists dismissed the councils entirely as a distraction from seizing political power at the center. Gramsci fought on multiple fronts, exhausted, running on black coffee and cigarettes, sometimes sleeping in the office. By early 1920, L'Ordine Nuovo had become the voice of the Turin metalworkers. They began to see the factory differently. It was no longer just a site of exploitation. It was the nucleus of a new state. Then came the clock strike. In April 1920, a dispute over daylight saving time escalated into something larger, a test of whether the factory councils could hold their ground. The strike isolated the Turin workers. The National Socialist Party refused to spread the conflict. The trade unions held back. Gramsci and his ordinavisti faced the combined power of the state and the employers alone. The strike failed. He watched the defeat with bitterness, noting the opportunism of union leaders who feared the creative energy of the rank and file. Yet he believed the councils had planted something that could not be uprooted. Summer approached. The metalworkers demanded wage increases. The industrialists refused. Negotiations collapsed. What came next would push the cities of Milan, Turin, and Genoa to the edge of civil war. Chapter 5. The Occupation of the Factories. September 1920. The wage negotiations at Alfa Romeo in Milan had collapsed, and management responded with a lockout. The idea was simple enough. Starve the union into submission, close the gates, wait for hunger to do its work. But something unexpected happened instead. The workers in Turin refused to leave. Following the strategy Gramsci had championed in the pages of L'Ordine Nuovo, they locked themselves inside. Within days, more than 400,000 workers had occupied factories across Italy. Red flags flew over the gates of Fiat and Lancia. Armed patrols called Red Guards walked the perimeters, and production continued. Picture the scene. The bosses are locked out of their own buildings. The machines are still running. The workers are making cars, making steel, making everything they made before, only now without anyone telling them what to do. For Gramsci, this was proof of everything he had argued. The working class was not merely capable of resistance, it was capable of creation. He moved through the occupied plants like a man possessed. His small frame was already exhausted, his health fragile, but he slept little during those weeks. He observed the frantic efforts to secure raw materials, the improvisations required to keep output going despite the blockade the industrialists had imposed from outside. He wrote furiously for the paper, declaring that the hierarchy was broken, that the workers had achieved what he called spiritual maturity. Inside the factories, theft was almost non-existent. Violence, too. A strange new order had taken hold among the machinery and the smoke. The Liberal government watched and did nothing. Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti, the old fox of Italian politics, refused to send in the army. He calculated that the movement would collapse on its own if left alone long enough. Let them try to run the factories, he told the panicking industrialists. Let them fail. Better that than blood in the streets and martyrs for the cause. He retreated to his holiday home in the mountains and waited. Gramsci understood the trap. An occupation without political power was a siege in reverse. The workers controlled the buildings, but they had no access to credit, no access to markets. They could produce, but they could not sell. Without seizing the state itself, the whole thing would suffocate. And then the union leadership intervened. The CGL, the National Trade Union Confederation, pushed for a settlement. In a meeting in Milan, they put the question of revolution to a formal vote. Gramsci watched this bureaucratic theatre with something close to despair. The Socialist Party leadership, paralyzed by indecision, terrified of civil war, simply abdicated. At the moment when everything hung in the balance, there was no one willing to lead. He wrote that the Italian socialist leaders were not revolutionaries at all. They were notaries, men who recorded events rather than shaped them. They were afraid of the very power they claimed to represent. Giolitti brokered a compromise in late September. The workers would get union representation in management decisions. It sounded like a victory. It was a piece of paper. The promise was never kept. The workers marched out of the factories, undefeated in any military sense. No army had driven them out. No battle had been lost. And yet they were broken. The moment had passed. What remained was a feeling of betrayal that curdled quickly into disillusionment. Gramsci watched the retreat with a heavy heart. The working class had demonstrated that it could run society. Its leaders had demonstrated that they could not run a revolution. He predicted that the bourgeoisie would not forget the fear they had felt during those weeks. Their relief would turn into something else. A desire for revenge against the people who had dared to touch their factories, their property, their world. The aftermath was swift. The industrialists founded new associations to enforce discipline and fund the rising squads of black shirts appearing in the cities. The failure of the factory councils to become something larger left a vacuum, and the reaction began to fill it. Demobilized officers, agrarian thugs from the countryside, men with clubs and castor oil. Winter came to Turin. The apartment where Gramsci worked had no heat. Across the Po Valley, the white terror of fascism had begun its systematic destruction of the labor leagues. The Socialist Party, with all its internal divisions and reformist hesitations, looked to Gramsci like a dead organism, incapable of facing what was coming. The need for a different kind of party became his obsession. Disciplined, decisive. A split was no longer a theoretical debate among intellectuals. It was becoming a matter of survival. Chapter 6. The Split at Livorno. It rained the day Italian socialism tore itself apart. January 1921. The delegates traveled to Livorno in sodden overcoats, their breath misting in unheated train carriages. Gramsci sat with the Turin contingent, a group of factory council veterans who had watched the occupation of the factories collapse 4 months earlier. They blamed the reformists. They blamed the union bosses who had traded revolution for wage increases, and now they were traveling to a party congress to finish what the defeat had started. The Socialist Party had booked the Goldoni Theatre for the proceedings. Velvet seats, gilded balconies, the comfortable trappings of bourgeois culture. But the communist faction did not stay long. When it became clear that the reformists would not be expelled, they walked out. Hundreds of delegates filed through the doors and into the rain-slicked streets, marching in a ragged column toward a different venue entirely. They found the San Marco Theatre waiting for them. It was a wreck of a building. The roof leaked, the windows were cracked or missing altogether. Years of neglect had left it looking more like a warehouse than a place of performance. But perhaps that suited the occasion. The delegates crowded onto benches and folding chairs, water dripping from their hats, and declared themselves the Communist Party of Italy. The PCD. I was born in a building that couldn't keep out the weather. Gramsci watched from the press gallery, a section the delegates called the Gabbione, which translates roughly as the cage. He did not speak from the podium. His voice had never been strong, and in that cavernous space it would have been swallowed entirely. The man who dominated the proceedings was Amedeo Bordiga, a Neapolitan engineer with a booming delivery and an absolute certainty in his own positions. Bordiga commanded the room. He promised action, purity, discipline. He dismissed parliamentary politics as a waste of time. The young delegates loved him for it. Gramsci had his doubts. He found Bordiga's thinking too rigid, too mechanical. The man treated revolution like a mathematical equation, as if history could be solved rather than shaped. But Gramsci kept quiet. Unity mattered more than being right. The revolutionary faction needed to hold together, even if its leader was someone Gramsci privately considered a brilliant sectarian with no feel for the actual texture of Italian society. Inside the San Marco, the atmosphere verged on religious ecstasy. Delegates sang the Internationale with their fists raised. They swore allegiance to Moscow and the Third International. They believed the revolution was still coming, perhaps within months. Fascism, in their view, was a temporary spasm, a firework thrown up by a dying bourgeoisie. It would burn itself out soon enough. Gramsci was not so sure. While the communists debated doctrine in their leaking theatre, fascist squads were burning down labor halls across the country. They beat organizers with cudgels. They forced castor oil down the throats of socialist mayors. And the police, the judges, the army, all of them looked the other way or actively helped. Gramsci saw something new in this violence, something the party leadership refused to recognize. Fascism was not simply the old ruling class defending itself. It was the petty bourgeoisie in revolt, shopkeepers and small landowners and demobilized soldiers who had been promised a world and received nothing. That made it unpredictable. That made it dangerous. He wrote to a friend that the split had been necessary but painful, a surgical amputation performed without anesthetic on a body already weakened by defeat. The Communist Party had been born, but it had left the majority of the working class behind, still loyal to the old Socialist Party. The vanguard had isolated itself at precisely the moment when unity against the blackshirts mattered most. Gramsci returned to Turin with a seat on the new Central Committee but little actual power. Bordiga ran the party from Naples, and his word was law. The Ordine Nuovo became a daily newspaper, but its readership had splintered along with the movement. Gramsci lived a monastic existence, eating cheap meals in workers' trattorias, sleeping in a small rented room, moving frequently to stay ahead of the police who tracked his every step. The violence followed him home. Fascist squads began targeting communist leaders in Turin, staging what they called punitive expeditions. Gramsci changed addresses constantly. He watched the liberal state reveal its true nature, shedding its democratic pretenses to protect the economic order underneath. The Red 2 years were over. The Black 2 years had begun. And somewhere in a rain-damaged theatre in Livorno, a party had been born that did not yet understand what it was up against. Chapter 7. Love and Lenin in Moscow. Gramsci arrived in Moscow in June of 1922. He was 31 years old, and by his own account, he was finished. He described his life to that point as a cold flame, a bramble patch. His body had given out. His nerves had followed. Grigory Zinoviev, the president of the Comintern, took one look at him and ordered him to a sanatorium. The place was called Serebriany Bor, Silver Forest. It sat on the outskirts of Moscow, a cluster of white buildings hidden among birch trees, where the Soviet elite came to recover from the strain of building a new world. The silence there was almost total. Snow muffled everything. Gramsci walked the grounds slowly, his crooked spine aching in the cold, and tried to remember what it felt like to sleep through the night. It was here that he met the Schucht family. They were Russian aristocrats who had become revolutionaries, which was not as unusual as it sounds. The patriarch, Apollon Schucht, had been a Tsarist officer before he turned against the regime. He had known Lenin personally, had hosted the young revolutionary in his home during the years of exile. His daughters had grown up between two worlds, speaking Italian as fluently as Russian, moving through European capitals like ghosts of a vanished order. Gramsci first grew close to Eugenia, the eldest daughter. She was a patient at the clinic, suffering from a paralysis of the legs caused by nerve contraction. They spent long afternoons together, talking about literature and philosophy, their conversations stretching into the pale northern evenings, but his attention soon drifted to her younger sister, Julia. She was a violinist who came to the sanatorium to care for Eugenia, and Gramsci found himself watching her. He noticed the angle of her cheekbone, the way her chestnut braid rested on her shoulders. The courtship was awkward. Gramsci approached love the way he approached everything else, with a kind of pedagogical intensity that must have been exhausting to be on the receiving end of. He tried to educate Julia. He scolded her for what he called her inferiority complex, her passivity toward her domineering sister. He wanted to reshape her, to make her into something. It was not the most romantic of approaches. But Julia saw something in him anyway. That November, the Fourth Congress of the Comintern convened in Moscow. It would be the last one attended by Lenin. The leader was already showing signs of the strokes that would kill him within 2 years, though the party maintained what Gramsci called a conspiracy of silence about his condition. In the corridors of the Kremlin, Gramsci encountered him briefly. Lenin spoke to him in Italian, asking about the situation back home with a directness and pragmatism that stood in sharp contrast to the rigid sectarianism of Bordiga. Gramsci watched the man carefully. He sensed the tremors of the succession crisis already beginning beneath the surface, the tension between Stalin and Trotsky that would eventually consume everything. By December of 1923, the party had ordered Gramsci to Vienna. He was to organize a new foreign bureau there to rebuild the shattered Italian movement from a distance. Julia was pregnant. He left Moscow with a heavy heart, knowing he might not return for a long time. He established a correspondence with her that became his lifeline, though her replies were erratic and the waiting between letters was its own kind of torture. Vienna was cold. His room sat on the outskirts of the city, in a building where the stove heated poorly and the German-style bed had a duvet that slipped off in the night. He would wake with a frozen shoulder, his body curled against the chill. He described himself as a wolf in his den, waiting for news from Russia, trying to manage factional battles within the party through letters that took weeks to arrive. His son Delio was born in August of 1924. Gramsci received the news in Vienna, hundreds of miles from the child he could not hold. He confessed to Julia that he could not imagine himself as a father. The role felt abstract and terrifying to a man whose own father had been a source of shame and silence. He asked for photographs. He asked for minute details about the baby's face, his hands, the sounds he made. He tried to construct a relationship through paper, building a child in his mind from fragments of description. During those long months in Vienna, something began to shift in his thinking. He spent his days in cafes, reading foreign newspapers, trying to understand why capitalism in the West proved so resilient when it had collapsed so quickly in Russia. The answer, he began to suspect, lay in what he would later call the superstructures of civil society: schools, churches, newspapers, professional associations. In Russia, the state had been everything, and civil society had been, in his phrase, primordial and gelatinous. A single blow had shattered it. But in the West, these institutions formed a series of trenches protecting the existing order. Any revolution here would have to be different. It would require not a sudden assault, but a long war of position. He wrote letters to his subordinates in Italy, urging them to abandon their apocalyptic expectations of immediate revolution. The fascists were consolidating power. The moment for a frontal attack had passed, if it had ever existed at all. What was needed now was patience, organization, the slow work of building a new culture capable of challenging the old. It was not the message his comrades wanted to hear. Chapter 8. The Deputy and the Crisis. In April of 1924, Antonio Gramsci won a seat in the Italian Chamber of Deputies. The victory came with a gift more precious than any title: parliamentary immunity. It meant he could finally cross the border and return to his homeland without being clapped in irons the moment his feet touched Italian soil. The country he returned to was not the one he had left. Fear had seeped into everything. The fascist militia, once a gang of thugs in black shirts, had been absorbed into the machinery of the state. They wore uniforms now. They carried official stamps. The opposition, such as it was, moved through Rome like men walking on broken glass. Gramsci arrived in the capital just weeks before everything shattered. On the 10th of June, fascist hitmen kidnapped Giacomo Matteotti, a socialist deputy who had stood in Parliament and read aloud a catalogue of fascist crimes during the recent elections. They stabbed him repeatedly and left his body in a shallow grave outside the city. It took 2 months to find him. The murder should have ended Mussolini. Public outrage swelled to a point where even the dictator's allies began to edge away. Newspapers that had kept quiet suddenly found their voices. For a few trembling weeks, the regime looked like it might collapse under the weight of its own brutality. The opposition parties responded by walking out of Parliament. They called it the Aventine Secession, named after the hill where the Roman plebeians had once retreated in protest against the patricians. It was meant to be a grand moral gesture, a refusal to participate in a corrupted institution. Gramsci watched this unfold with something close to despair. He saw what the others could not or would not admit. By leaving the chamber empty, the opposition had handed Mussolini the one thing he needed most: time. The fascists still controlled the police. They still controlled the army. They still controlled the levers of the state. A boycott changed none of that. He proposed something different: an anti-parliament, built not on the rituals of bourgeois democracy, but on the workers' and peasants' committees that still existed in the factories and the fields. The moderate socialists recoiled from the idea. The Republicans wanted nothing to do with it. They were waiting for the king to intervene, to dismiss Mussolini and restore order. Gramsci understood that a monarch who had already handed the country to the blackshirts was not going to take it back. He assumed leadership of the Communist Party that same year, beginning a methodical campaign to reshape it from within. The old guard, loyal to Bordiga and his rigid theories, had to be replaced. Gramsci traveled constantly, often in disguise, holding meetings in the forests of the Sila Mountains and the valleys of the north. He was rebuilding an illegal apparatus in a country where the legal one had already been dismantled. In Rome, he rented a furnished room from a German family at Via Morgagni 25. The police watched the building. They noted his visitors, his letters, the hours he kept. He lived in a state of permanent surveillance, a fish swimming in a bowl. There was a brief interruption to this solitude. In the autumn of 1925, Julia arrived from Moscow with their infant son, Delio. For a few months, they lived together in a rented apartment, something approaching a family. But the reality was harder than the idea. Gramsci was consumed by the work. The danger was constant. Julia struggled with the alien atmosphere of a police state and with her own fragile mental health. Eventually, she took Delio and returned to Russia. Gramsci wrote to her of the world large and terrible that their son would have to learn to conquer. In May of 1925, he rose to speak in the Chamber of Deputies. It was the only speech he would ever give there. The occasion was a proposed law against Freemasonry, a piece of legislation that was really a weapon aimed at all opposition associations. Mussolini himself sat in the chamber that day. Gramsci stood at the podium, small and hunched, his voice thin but steady. He dissected the law with the precision of a surgeon. The fascist deputies jeered. Mussolini interrupted him repeatedly. Gramsci did not flinch. He told them plainly why they wanted to destroy the proletarian organizations. Because those organizations were the only serious threat to their dominance. When someone shouted that the communists should be silenced, he replied that they were the only ones who would tell the truth. The following January, the party held its congress in Lyons, across the border in France, where the fascist police could not reach them. Gramsci secured a decisive victory over Bordiga's faction. The new platform, known as the Lyons Theses, argued that revolution in Italy would require an alliance between the industrial workers of the North and the peasants of the South. The Southern question was not merely a problem of poverty, it was a colonial relationship, with the peasants serving as an internal colony exploited by the industrial heartland. This was new. This would become the foundation of everything he wrote in the years to come. The regime, meanwhile, was sealing every exit. The Matteotti crisis had passed without consequence. The king had done nothing. The opposition had achieved nothing with their grand gesture. Mussolini emerged from the scandal stronger than before, his enemies scattered and demoralized. The last cracks of legal opposition were being filled with cement. Gramsci continued his work in the shadows, organizing what could still be organized, writing what could still be written. He did not know that his time was running out, that within months the cage would close around him completely. Chapter 9. The Trap and the Arrest. In October of 1926, Gramsci sat down to write what may have been the most dangerous letter of his life. It was addressed to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and it carried a warning. The brutal struggle between Stalin's majority and Trotsky's opposition was tearing the movement apart. He urged restraint. He reminded the Russian leaders that they held the trust of workers across the entire world in their hands, and that trust could be squandered through excessive measures and factional vengeance. The letter never arrived. Palmiro Togliatti the Italian party's representative in Moscow, intercepted it. He refused to pass it on, fearing it would alienate the Soviet leadership at precisely the wrong moment. When Gramsci found out, he was furious. He accused Togliatti of bureaucratic blindness, of putting institutional loyalty above principle. Togliatti fired back, accusing Gramsci of endangering the unity of the international movement. The rupture was complete, and it left Gramsci politically isolated at the worst possible time, just as the net was closing around him back home in Italy. The pretext came on the 31st of October. A 15-year-old boy named Anteo Zamboni allegedly fired a shot at Mussolini's car as it rolled through Bologna. Within seconds, the crowd had lynched him. Whether the boy actually fired the shot, whether there even was a shot, remains disputed to this day. But it didn't matter. The regime had what it needed. Within days, Mussolini unleashed the exceptional laws for the defense of the state. All opposition parties were dissolved. The remaining non-fascist newspapers were shut down. A special tribunal was established to try political enemies outside the normal court system. Parliamentary immunity, that thin legal shield, meant nothing now. Gramsci knew he was a target. On November the 8th, he was preparing to travel to a secret meeting near Genoa, but something made him cancel. A sense of danger, perhaps. An instinct. Late that evening, police agents arrived at his apartment on Via Morgagni. They did not present a warrant. They simply invited him to come to the Questura for clarifications. He packed a small bag, a few books, some linen. He maintained a calm demeanor as they led him out the door. He would never walk through it again as a free man. They took him to Regina Coeli prison in Rome. He was thrown into a solitary cell. Filth, darkness, the psychological shock of sudden captivity. He later described this as the worst period of his entire detention. Worse even than what came after. The intake procedures were designed to humiliate. The stripping, the searching, the numbering. He refused to let it break him. He observed the common criminals around him with the eye of an anthropologist, noting their slang, their hierarchies, the codes by which they organized their world behind bars. Even in catastrophe, he maintained his meticulous sense of personal honor. He wrote to his landlady, asking her to pay his outstanding rent. He wrote to his mother in Sardinia, a letter of stoic reassurance. "I am tranquil and serene," he told her. "Deep down there is always a point of gay humor that helps me live." He insisted that she must not be ashamed of his imprisonment. It was the result of his refusal to compromise his beliefs. A dignity of men, he called it, something he valued above physical liberty itself. The regime moved quickly to strip him of his parliamentary mandate, removing the last legal obstacle to his indefinite detention. Gramsci understood now that this was not temporary. These were not police measures that would be lifted in a few weeks or months. This was a systematic attempt to bury him alive. He began to organize his mind for a long siege. He requested books on history and languages. He was determined to transform his cell into a study, to make something useful of the years stretching out before him. What he did not know was that Mussolini had personally reviewed his file. The dictator was paying attention, and the prosecutor assigned to his case would soon stand before the special tribunal and make a demand that became infamous. This brain, he would say, must be stopped from working for 20 years. The legal fiction of immunity had dissolved. The steel doors of Regina Coeli had shut behind him. But Rome was not remote enough for the regime's most dangerous prisoner. They would drag him in chains to a small island in the Mediterranean, far from anyone who might hear him think. Chapter 10. The School of Ustica and the Trial. The journey began at 4 in the morning. Guards roused Gramsci from his cell in Regina Coeli prison, shackled his wrists with iron cuffs, and linked him by heavy chain to a line of common criminals. They loaded him into what the prisoners called a cellular van, a vehicle that felt less like transport and more like a rolling coffin. The destination was the island of Ustica, a volcanic rock north of Sicily. The route would take weeks. He passed through transit prisons in Naples and Palermo, each one filthier than the last. In the holding cells, he observed the men around him with the detached curiosity of someone taking field notes. Their slang, their hierarchies, the unwritten codes that governed who ate first and who slept where. When the boat crossing was delayed by rough seas, he spent days in a damp ship's hold, seasick and shivering. He wrote to Tatiana, describing the ordeal as an expedition rather than a punishment. The dark humor was deliberate. It was how he kept his mind from breaking. Ustica, when he finally arrived, was something unexpected. The regime's grip loosened on that remote island. Detainees could walk freely through the village during daylight hours, could sit in cafes and buy cigarettes. It was an open-air prison, which meant something closer to exile than incarceration. And there, in a small rented house, Gramsci found himself living alongside Amadeo Bordiga. The two men had been bitter rivals. Bordiga was the sectarian engineer, the imposing Neapolitan giant whom Gramsci had ousted from the party leadership only months before their arrests. They had argued over strategy, over tactics, over the very soul of Italian communism. Now they shared coffee in the mornings and cigarettes in the evenings. They talked about books. They talked about their families. The ideological battles faded into something more human. Two men helping each other survive the boredom and isolation of a Mediterranean nowhere. Together they organized a school. Bordiga taught science and engineering to anyone who wanted to learn. Gramsci lectured on history and literature. The students were not just political prisoners, but common criminals too. Men who had never finished primary school, men who could barely read. The school broke down barriers that the Italian state had spent centuries reinforcing. A pickpocket from Calabria sat beside a former member of parliament, both of them scribbling notes on whatever scraps of paper they could find. Gramsci threw himself into the practical work of building a community. He helped organize a common mess hall so the prisoners could pool their meager government allowance and stretch it further. He planned a library. He wrote to his friend Piero Sraffa, an economist teaching at Cambridge, requesting books on political science and history, Machiavelli, Benedetto Croce. His mind was already turning toward something larger, a grand analysis of the Italian state and how it had failed its people. The calm lasted 44 days. Then a new warrant arrived from Milan, charging him with fomenting civil war. The holiday was over. The transfer north nearly killed him. He traveled for weeks in unheated train cars through the January cold, without a proper coat, shivering so violently he believed his body would simply give out. In Milan's San Vittore prison, he faced the examining magistrate Massis, a fellow Sardinian who played a careful game of false sympathy. Massis urged him to repent, to cooperate, all while constructing the legal cage that would hold Gramsci for the rest of his life. The psychological pressure brought back the insomnia, the headaches he described as a hammer beating against his temples. The trial began in Rome in May of 1928. They called it the processione, the big trial. 22 defendants sat inside a large iron cage in the courtroom, Gramsci among them, alongside Terracini and Scocchimaro and the other remnants of the party leadership. The atmosphere was theatrical. The outcome was predetermined. Everyone in the room knew it. The prosecutor, Michele Isgro, did not bother with legal subtleties. He delivered a political sermon, pointing his finger at the small, hunchbacked man in the cage. "We must stop this brain from working for 20 years. That was the phrase that would survive. Not an argument about evidence or guilt, but a confession of what the trial actually was. When the defense attorneys tried to object, the judges mocked them. One admitted openly that the lawyers were correct on points of law but had forgotten one thing. This was a political tribunal. Gramsci refused to answer questions about the party's clandestine networks. He would not betray his comrades, but he defended his ideas with absolute clarity. He told the court he was a communist, and that if this carried a penalty, he accepted it. The prosecutor seized on this, branding Gramsci the mind of the revolution, while the others were merely the arms. On the 4th of June, they read the sentence: 20 years, 4 months, and 5 days. Gramsci received the verdict with a stoic smile. He understood that his role had changed. He was no longer a political actor capable of shaping events. He had become a historical witness, someone whose suffering would be recorded and remembered long after the judges and prosecutors had been forgotten. The iron doors of the Italian judicial system had locked shut. Now he would be transferred south to a remote prison designed for the physically infirm, where the fascist state intended to let his body slowly fall apart while his mind fought to survive the silence. Chapter 11. Turi and the Will to Study. They brought him to Turi on the 19th of July, 1928. The penitentiary sat in the Apulian countryside, like something left over from another century, which it was. The Spanish had built it in the 1700s, a massive stone structure designed to hold men until they were forgotten. Now it held Gramsci, prisoner number 7047. The dormitory was a kind of hell. 5 other men shared the space, and the noise never stopped. Coughing, arguing, the clang of metal, the smell of bodies pressed too close together in the southern heat. For a man who needed silence to think, who had spent his life turning ideas over in his mind like stones in his palm, the assault on his senses was unbearable. His body began to fail almost immediately. A violent herpes infection made sitting agony, made lying down agony. His teeth loosened and fell out one by one, casualties of chronic uricemia. Until he could no longer chew solid food, he survived on liquids, soft mashes, whatever he could swallow without the mechanics of eating. The hunchbacked intellectual who had once terrified Mussolini in Parliament now shuffled through the prison corridors like an old man, though he was only 37. He petitioned for a single cell. The request was not about comfort or privilege. It was about survival. He argued that his ailments required isolation from the chaotic rhythms of the common dormitory, and eventually the authorities relented. But the cell brought its own torments. The screams of other inmates echoed through the stone walls at all hours. Iron gates banged, the heat pressed down like a physical weight. He paced for hours in the darkness, unable to sleep, his mind racing through what he later described as hallucinatory exhaustion. He wrote to his mother in Sardinia. He lied to her. He told her he was fine. He could not bear to let her know the truth. She was old, she was far away, and the distance between Turi and Ailes might as well have been the distance between planets. His wife, Julia, was in Moscow, her letters rare and increasingly incoherent. Something was happening to her mind, though he could not know the full extent of it from his cell. He depended entirely on Tatiana Schucht, Julia's sister, who had moved to Italy to serve as his lifeline. She visited when she could. She brought food, medicine, books. She carried his thoughts to the outside world and brought back whatever fragments of news she could gather. He was sometimes cruel to her, irritated by what he called her morbid solicitude, her attempts to manage his suffering. Yet he knew that without her heroic dedication, he would be utterly alone. In January of 1929, after months of petitions, he received authorization to keep pen and paper in his cell. He described this to Tatiana as the satisfaction of his greatest aspiration as a prisoner. Other men might have asked for better food, medical care, contact with family. Gramsci asked for the tools of thought. He decided to write something that would last, a work for ewig, he called it, borrowing the German for eternity. He would not waste his imprisonment on bitterness or despair. He would not become one of those hollow men he saw shuffling through the corridors, their personalities destroyed molecule by molecule by the regime of captivity. He would study instead. He would think. He would resist by refusing to stop being himself. On the 8th of February, he opened his first notebook. He started modestly with translations, Goethe, the Brothers Grimm, exercises to get his hand back in, to discipline his scattered mind before attempting original thought. He asked Tatiana to send books on history, philosophy, economics. He wanted to understand something specific. How had the Italian public spirit been formed? What role had intellectuals played in shaping it? And underneath those questions, the one that haunted him most, why had the revolution failed? The physical act of writing was torture. He sat on a hard wooden stool, his spine screaming, his stomach churning, and filled page after page with microscopic handwriting. The calligraphy was precise, disciplined, as if the control he exerted over his pen was the last form of control left to him. He compared himself to a survivor of a shipwreck, noting that his life had become molecular, composed of tiny, insignificant events that he had to fill with meaning to avoid sliding into stupor. The stack of school exercise books began to grow on his small wooden table. He had found his weapon against the prison. He had found his way to remain alive inside his own mind, even as his body continued its slow collapse around him. Chapter 12. The Prison Notebooks, History and Hegemony. The cell measured 3 meters by 3, a cot, a small table, a chair, and in this space Antonio Gramsci began to build something immense. The notebooks arrived one at a time, cheap school exercise books with lined pages. He filled them in a cramped hand, working by the dim light that came through the bars. Over the years, he would produce 33 of them, more than 4,000 pages of notes, fragments, revisions, and questions. He did not write in chapters, he wrote in pieces. An idea would appear, be developed for a page or 2, then reappear notebooks later in a different form. He grouped his thoughts under headings, then regrouped them. He revised constantly. The effect is less like reading a book and more like watching a mind at work, circling around problems, refusing easy answers. Some scholars have called it an anti-encyclopedia, a maze of thought rather than a monument. The central question was this: why had fascism won? Gramsci refused to see Mussolini's rise as an accident or as the work of one demagogue. He believed the catastrophe had roots that stretched back decades, even centuries. To understand the present, he had to excavate the past. He turned first to the Risorgimento. This was the great movement of the 19th century that had unified Italy from a patchwork of kingdoms and duchies into a single nation. It was celebrated as a heroic awakening, the birth of modern Italy. Gramsci saw something else. He argued that unification had been a passive revolution, a change orchestrated from above by elites who never truly mobilized the peasant masses. The Jacobins in France had unleashed popular energy, for better and worse. The Italian leaders had kept the people at arm's length. The result was a state that looked modern but rested on fragile foundations. The southern peasants remained excluded, impoverished, distrustful of Rome. The gap between rulers and ruled had never closed. He needed a target for his critique, and he found one in Benedetto Croce. Croce was the dominant Italian intellectual of the age, a philosopher and historian whose influence stretched across universities, publishing houses, and political circles. Gramsci treated him as a kind of secular pope. He admired Croce's intellect, but dissected his work with surgical precision. Croce wrote history as a series of ethical and political moments, the unfolding of spirit and culture. Gramsci argued this was a sanitized version of the past. It conveniently ignored the brutal class struggles, the misery of the South, the violence that underpinned the liberal state. Croce's philosophy, however elegant, provided ideological cover for the conservative order. Against this, Gramsci developed what he called the philosophy of praxis. The phrase was a code. He could not write openly about Marxism without the censor's pen striking through his words, so he invented his own vocabulary. Lenin became Illichi. Marxism became the philosophy of praxis. This necessity forced him to refine his concepts, stripping away jargon and dogma. The philosophy of praxis united thought and action. It saw history not as the unfolding of an abstract spirit, but as the product of human labor and struggle. Ideas were not floating above society. They were embedded in it, shaped by material conditions, wielded by classes in conflict. From these reflections emerged something that would make Gramsci famous long after his death. He began to develop a concept he called hegemony. The word existed before him, but he was transforming its meaning. He moved beyond the simple idea of political domination. Hegemony, for Gramsci, meant intellectual and moral leadership. A ruling class did not hold power through force alone. It held power because its worldview had become the common sense of society. Its values were taught in schools, preached in churches, repeated in newspapers, assumed in daily conversation. People consented to their own subordination because they had absorbed, often without realizing it, the ideas of those who ruled them. He would develop this insight further in the notebooks to come. The notebooks sat in a precarious archive. Gramsci was allowed to keep only a few in his cell at any time. The completed ones were stored in the prison warehouse, subject to the whims of guards and regulations. He wrote knowing that everything could be confiscated, lost, destroyed. And yet he continued, page after page, fragment after fragment, building his labyrinth in the dark. Chapter 13. The Modern Prince. There is a book that has haunted political thinkers for 500 years. Niccolò Machiavelli wrote it in 1516. Exiled from Florence, disgraced and desperate, he had been a diplomat, a man who understood the machinery of power from the inside. Then he lost everything, and in that loss he sat down and wrote The Prince. Gramsci found himself returning to Machiavelli again and again in his cell. The parallels were hard to ignore. Both men had been defeated. Both were writing in isolation, cut off from the political world they understood so intimately. Both were trying to explain how power actually works, stripped of comfortable illusions. Most readers treated The Prince as a handbook for tyrants, a cold instruction manual on how to seize and keep power through manipulation and force. Gramsci saw something different. He believed Machiavelli was writing not for princes, but for the people. The book revealed the hidden mechanics of domination so that ordinary citizens might finally understand what was being done to them. It was, in his reading, a revolutionary act disguised as advice for rulers. But here was the problem. In the 20th century, there could be no individual prince. No single figure could embody the kind of transformation society needed. The age of heroic leaders founding states through sheer will had passed, if it had ever truly existed. Something else was required. Gramsci called it the modern prince, and by this he meant the political party. A collective organism that could think and act and adapt. The party would be the proclaimer and organizer of an intellectual and moral reform. It would create what the Italian middle class had failed to create during unification. A genuine national will that included the peasants, the workers, the forgotten masses of the South. This led him to one of his most enduring ideas. He drew a distinction between two kinds of intellectuals. The first he called traditional intellectuals. These were the priests and professors, the philosophers and literary critics who imagined themselves floating above society, independent of any particular class interest. They saw their work as timeless, universal, detached from the grubby business of economics and politics. The second kind he called organic intellectuals. These emerged directly from a social class and articulated its world-view. The factory manager was an organic intellectual of the bourgeoisie. The trade union organizer could be an organic intellectual of the working class. Every social group, as it formed itself, generated people who gave it coherence and direction. The question was whether these intellectuals would simply maintain the existing order or work to transform it. Gramsci insisted that all human beings are intellectuals in some sense. Everyone thinks. Everyone has a conception of the world, however fragmentary or contradictory. The person who works with their hands cannot be separated from the person who thinks, but not everyone has the social function of an intellectual. The task of the modern prince was to change that, to raise the intellectual level of the masses until they could think and act as a ruling class themselves. He expanded his understanding of the state itself. Most people thought of the state as police and courts, parliaments and armies. Gramsci argued this was far too narrow. The state included what he called civil society, the schools that taught children what to think, the newspapers that told adults what mattered, the churches that shaped moral intuitions, the associations and clubs that organized social life. All of these functioned as fortresses protecting the dominant order. They were where hegemony was manufactured and maintained. This explained why the Bolshevik strategy could not simply be repeated in Western Europe. In Russia, the state had been everything and civil society almost nothing. A direct assault on political power made sense there. But in Italy, in France, in Germany, the state was protected by this vast network of cultural institutions. You could not simply storm the Winter Palace. You had to win the schools and the newspapers and the common sense of millions of people first. He called this the war of position, a long struggle through civil society, building alliances, transforming consciousness, creating a new culture before seizing political power. It was slower than revolution, less dramatic, but it was the only path that made sense in societies where the ruling class had dug itself so deeply into everyday life. The notebooks were themselves an act of war by position. A prisoner, alone in his cell, trying to change how people thought about the world. Chapter 14. Americanism and the Subalterns. Gramsci turned his attention westward, across the Atlantic, to the strange new civilization rising in America. He devoted an entire notebook to the phenomenon. Henry Ford's assembly lines had captured the imagination of Europe, and Gramsci wanted to understand why. What he saw was not simply a faster way to build automobiles. It was something far more ambitious. Ford was attempting to create a new type of human being. The assembly line demanded workers who could sustain intense physical and nervous exhaustion hour after hour, day after day. To get such workers, Ford paid high wages, but Gramsci understood that these wages were not acts of generosity. They were instruments of control. The logic was brutally simple. Pay a man enough, and he becomes dependent on that income. He cannot afford to lose his job. He will submit to the discipline of the factory. He will show up on time, sober, rested, ready to work. Ford's famous $5 day bought not just labor, but obedience. Gramsci noticed that American industrialists did not stop at the factory gates. They sent investigators into workers' homes to check on their living conditions, their drinking habits, their marriages. This might have seemed like paternalism or mere nosiness, but Gramsci saw it as something more systematic. The company needed workers whose entire lives were organized around production. A man who drank too much or stayed out late or exhausted himself in romantic adventures would be useless on the assembly line the next morning. He connected this to the strange American experiment of prohibition. European intellectuals mocked it as hypocritical Puritanism, a nation of prudes trying to legislate morality. Gramsci disagreed. He thought the regulation of alcohol and sexual behavior served an economic purpose. The assembly line required the conservation of nervous energy. Every drop of vitality squandered in a speakeasy or a love affair was a drop unavailable for the machine. The new industrialism demanded, in his memorable phrase, a rigid discipline of the sexual instincts. Monogamy was not a moral choice, but an economic requirement. The worker's body and mind had to be rationalized, tuned like an engine, made predictable and efficient. Ford was not just manufacturing cars, he was manufacturing a new kind of person. Gramsci called this person, with characteristic bluntness, a trained gorilla. It was a grim vision, but Gramsci did not dismiss it as barbarism. He recognized that Europe would eventually have to reckon with this model. The old artisanal ways of working were dying. The future belonged to mass production, whether one liked it or not. The question was not whether to accept industrialism, but how to humanize it. While he analyzed the factory workers of Detroit, he also turned his attention to a very different group. He called them the subaltern classes. These were the people excluded from power, the ones whose history never got written, the peasants and laborers and servants whose lives left no trace in official records. Their history, he noted, was always fragmented and episodic. The ruling classes had archives, monuments, continuous narratives stretching back centuries. The subalterns had only scattered memories, local legends, songs passed down through generations. Their resistance to power took pathological forms, erupting in banditry or religious fanaticism because they lacked the political organization to channel their grievances into coherent demands. He studied their folklore with unusual seriousness. Most intellectuals treated peasant superstitions as quaint curiosities, material for anthropologists and collectors of folk songs. Gramsci saw something else. Folklore was a conception of the world, a philosophy of the non-philosophers. It was incoherent, certainly. It mixed Stone Age superstitions with fragments of scientific ideas, Catholic ritual with pagan survivals, but it was tenacious. It shaped how millions of people understood their lives. To change the world, he argued, one had to first understand this common sense. You could not simply impose a new ideology from above. You had to engage with what people already believed, however confused or contradictory those beliefs might be. The task was to transform common sense into good sense, to help the subalterns develop a critical awareness of their own condition. He applied this analysis to the Southern question, the old problem of Italy's divided geography. The industrial North had reduced the agricultural South to a semi-colonial market. Southern peasants grew food and provided cheap labor, while northern factories took the profits. A block of landowners and local intellectuals kept the system running, ensuring that the peasants remained passive and fragmented. Gramsci believed these subalterns could become a revolutionary force, but only if they broke free from the petty intellectuals and village priests who kept them loyal to the landowners. A new culture would have to rise from below, organizing scattered discontent into unified political will. This was the work of the modern prince. He wrote all of this in a prison cell, his body failing, his handwriting growing smaller and more cramped as his strength ebbed. The notebooks piled up, dense with analysis of American factories and Sardinian peasants, of Ford's assembly lines and Southern folklore. Outside the walls, the regime that had imprisoned him continued its work. Inside, Gramsci continued his. Chapter 15. The Long Agony. By 1933, the prison at Turi had become something worse than a cell. It had become a place where Antonio Gramsci was dying by degrees, his body failing him in ways that seemed almost theatrical in their cruelty. He would lose consciousness without warning. His mind, that restless engine that had never stopped working, would seize up mid-thought. Words scattered before he could catch them. He described violent hammering against his temples, a phrase that captures something of the relentless assault his own skull had become. His teeth were gone by now. Uricemia had rotted them away, and he was reduced to swallowing food whole or surviving on liquids. His stomach, wrecked by years of prison rations, could barely process what little he managed to get down. He wrote to his sister-in-law, Tatiana, with the kind of clarity that only comes when pretense has become impossible. He told her he was interested in being removed from this hell where he was dying slowly. The word interested carries a strange formality, as though he were discussing a business arrangement rather than his own extinction. That letter finally stirred his family and the party into action. They began the exhausting process of seeking a transfer, navigating the bureaucratic maze of fascist Italy. The police chief, Bocchini, blocked them at every turn. He feared Gramsci might escape, though by this point the man could barely stand. In November of 1933, after months of delays, Gramsci was loaded into a cellular van and transported to the Cusumano clinic in Formia. The journey nearly killed him. He arrived shattered. The clinic was supposed to represent an improvement. In October of 1934, the authorities granted him what they called conditional liberty. The phrase was a joke. Carabinieri surrounded the building. His letters were still opened and read by censors. Tatiana noted that the surveillance had almost been strengthened compared to prison. He lived in what she called phenomenal isolation, watched night and day, technically free, but unable to leave, unable to see his children, unable to reach his wife, Julia, in Moscow. Julia had her own troubles by then. Her mental health had deteriorated, and the political climate under Stalin made any contact with a foreign prisoner complicated. Their correspondence, once so vital to Gramsci's sanity, had dwindled to silence. The distance between them had become more than geographical. In the summer of 1935, another crisis arrived. Tuberculosis and gout forced a final transfer, this time to the Quisisana clinic in Rome. The room he was given there would be the last place he ever lived. His body was demolished. A hernia made every movement agony. His liver, destroyed by a decade of inadequate food, was failing. And yet he continued to write letters to his children, letters about history and life, letters that mentioned nothing of what he was enduring. He wanted them to remember him as something other than a dying man in a monitored room. The prison notebooks sat untouched. That extraordinary will to study, the discipline that had sustained him through years of confinement, had finally given out. His body had won the argument. There was nothing left to give. In 1936, he made one last attempt. He wrote to Julia asking her to come to Italy. He wanted them to speak as friend to friend, to clear away what he called the morbid sentimentality and repression that had accumulated over their long separation. It was a plea for honesty at the end. She never came, whether she was unable or unwilling. The result was the same. Gramsci understood that he would die without seeing his family again. He began to dream of Sardinia. He talked about returning to Gilasa, to the house where he had grown up, to see it one last time. His doctors knew this was impossible. They let him talk about it anyway. On April 25th, 1937, the official decree of his full liberation arrived. His sentence had expired. That same evening, while eating dinner in his room, he suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage. He fell into a coma and lingered for 2 days. Tatiana stayed with him. She had been the one constant presence through the entire decade of his imprisonment, the one who had visited, written, fought the bureaucracy, smuggled out his notebooks page by page. He died at 4:40 in the morning on April 27th. He was 46 years old. In his room sat a wooden trunk containing 33 exercise books filled with his handwriting. Tatiana managed to get that trunk out of the clinic and eventually to Moscow, preserving the work that would make Gramsci, posthumously, the most translated and influential Italian author since Dante. The regime had wanted to stop his brain. In the end, they had only stopped his heart. Chapter 16. The Brain That Wouldn't Stop. What Tatiana saved was not a polished treatise. The pages held fragments, revisions, half-formed arguments, and passages that circled back on themselves. Gramsci had called his project a work for ewig, for forever, but it arrived in the world looking more like a construction site than a monument. There were gaps in the reasoning and questions left hanging. Some notes contradicted, others written months or years apart. Scholars would spend decades trying to determine when each passage was composed, whether a particular idea came before or after the early 1930s, when his health collapsed and his thinking shifted. This unfinished quality turned out to be the source of the notebook's strange power. A completed system can be accepted or rejected. A fragment invites you to keep thinking. Readers across generations have returned to these pages and found new arguments lurking in the margins, new applications for concepts Gramsci never lived to develop fully. The notebooks became a living document, closer to a conversation than a lecture. The concept that traveled furthest was hegemony. He had used it to explain why the Italian Risorgimento failed to create a true nation, why the masses remained passive while elites remade the state in their own image. But the idea proved portable. It offered a way to understand how power works in any society where the police and army alone are not enough, where control depends on schools and newspapers and churches shaping what people believe is normal, natural, inevitable. In the decades after the Second World War, scholars in Latin America and South Asia and Western Europe picked up the term and ran with it. Hegemony became a lens for examining everything from Hollywood films to colonial education systems. He also left behind the category of the subaltern. He had used the word carefully in his notebooks, aware that the prison censors might object to more explicit language. It referred to those groups written out of official history, the peasants and workers and colonized peoples whose worldview rarely made it into the archives. Gramsci insisted that their folklore mattered. Their common sense, however confused or contradictory, was a philosophy of sorts. Understanding it was the first step toward transforming it. This insight proved especially resonant in the post-colonial world, where intellectuals were searching for ways to write histories that included the people history had ignored. The bibliography on Gramsci has grown into something overwhelming. Month by month, year by year, new articles and books appear in Japanese and Portuguese and Arabic and dozens of other languages. He has become one of those figures whom everyone cites and few have read completely. His face appears on murals in Buenos Aires. His phrases show up in academic papers about subjects he never imagined. The short, hunchbacked man with the ruined spine became, after death, a global intellectual presence. Yet the monumental Gramsci threatens to obscure the suffering one. The man who wrote those notebooks also wrote letters to his wife that went unanswered for months. He tried to imagine himself as a father to sons he would never hold. He lay awake through countless nights, his body failing him in ways he concealed from his elderly mother. The prison had taken his teeth, his sleep, his ability to walk without pain. When he died, he weighed barely more than a child. The ideas that circulate so freely now were produced at tremendous personal cost. Each page a small act of resistance against a system designed to grind him into silence. He rests in the non-Catholic cemetery in Rome, not far from the graves of Keats and Shelley. The notebooks eventually found their way into print, though the editorial history is its own story of politics and revision. Debates continue over what Gramsci really meant, what he would have thought about this or that development, whether certain missing notebooks ever existed. None of it can be settled definitively. The questions he posed about intellectuals and ordinary people, about force and consent, about the long work of building a new culture before seizing the state, remain open. Which may be exactly how he would have wanted it. A finished answer can be filed away. An unfinished question keeps demanding attention. The brain they tried to stop is still working, decades after the man who carried it was laid in the ground.